There's a moment somewhere between midnight and dawn when the entire city of Rome used to wake up. Not an alarm, not from a nightmare, not because of fire or invasion or the cry of a newborn child. They woke up because it was simply time. Across the 7 hills, in marble villas and cramped insulae alike, eyes opened in the dark. Husbands spoke quietly to wives. Slaves stoked dying embers. Old men walked into moonlit gardens to think. Then, an hour or two later, they all lay back down and slept again until morning. For nearly 2,000 years, this hour in the dark was simply called in tempesta nox, the dead of night, the time outside of time. And for almost as long, modern history forgot it ever existed. We have been taught, almost without question, that human beings have always slept the way we sleep now, one long, unbroken stretch, beginning sometime after dusk and ending at first light. But what if that assumption is wrong? What if for most of human history, including the height of the Roman Empire, sleep was never meant to be unbroken at all? What if the 8-hour block we now treat as biological law is not ancient wisdom, but a relatively recent invention? And the Romans, the people who built roads that still exist, aqueducts that still stand, and laws that still echo through modern courts, slept in a way that would feel utterly alien to us today. This is the story of how Rome slept. It is a story about candlelight and fear, about gods who ruled the dark, about a city that technically had no clocks for its night hours at all, because for the Romans, night did not need to be measured, it needed to be survived. And by the time we reach the end of this story, you may never look at your own bed the same way again. To understand how Rome slept, you first have to understand something most people never think about. In the ancient world, darkness was not a backdrop, it was a force. Picture the city as the sun drops behind the Janiculum Hill. There are no streetlights, there is no electricity, no glass windows in most homes, no police patrolling in cars. The moment the sun disappears, Rome, a city that by the height of the empire may have held over 1 million people, does not gently dim, it goes black. Truly, completely black, in a way almost no person alive today has ever experienced, because even our darkest nights are stained with the glow of distant cities. In that darkness, the streets of Rome transformed. The poet and naturalist Juvenal, writing in the 1st century, described nights so dangerous that a man venturing out without making his will beforehand was considered a fool. Roof tiles fell from buildings, chamber pots were emptied from windows onto unsuspecting heads, and worse, robbers waited in alleys too narrow for 2 men to pass abreast. The wealthy, who had to travel at night, did so surrounded by slaves carrying torches, almost like a small army moving through enemy territory. So when night fell, Rome did something that feels almost unimaginable to modern city dwellers. It stopped. Shops closed, the Forum, alive with shouting merchants and arguing senators by day, emptied into silence. Families retreated behind heavy wooden doors, bolted shut, sometimes guarded by a dog whose bark alone was worth more than any lock. And here is where the story begins to bend away from everything we assume about the past. Inside those homes, as the oil lamps burned low and the family settled onto their beds, which for most Romans were not the soft mattresses we imagine, but simple wooden frames strung with rope or leather, topped with a stuffed mattress called a culcita, sleep did not behave the way we expect it to. They did not lie down at nightfall and rise unbroken 8 hours later. Instead, a Roman might fall asleep not long after dusk, and then, quietly, almost without surprise, wake up in the very heart of the night. And what they did in that waking hour reveals something profound about how differently the ancient mind related to rest, to darkness, and to time itself. Let's step inside one such home. We don't know her name, so let's simply call her Flavia. a baker's wife living in a cramped insula near the Subura, Rome's roughest, most crowded district. It is the dead of night. The oil lamp beside her bed burned out hours ago, but moonlight slips through a gap in the shutter. Flavia's eyes open, not because of a noise, not because of fear. Her body has simply finished her first sleep. This is not insomnia, this is not a disorder. Roman writers had a name for this state, and it appears across centuries of Latin literature with a casualness that tells us it was simply normal. The poet and naturalist sources, along with later medieval texts that preserve much older traditions, describe two distinct sleeps separated by a waking period, what some historians now call first sleep and second sleep, divided by an hour or more of quiet wakefulness in the depths of the night. In that hour, Flavia does not panic, and she does not reach for anything resembling what we'd call a phone, a book by electric light, or a screen. She simply exists in the dark. Perhaps she prays. Roman households kept small shrines to the lares, the household gods, and the dead of night was considered a sacred liminal time, neither yesterday nor tomorrow, when the boundary between the world of the living and the world of spirits was said to grow thin. Perhaps she speaks softly with her husband about debts, about their children, about the gossip of the bakery. Perhaps she simply lies still, listening to the silence of a city that for one suspended hour belongs to no one. And then, gradually, her eyelids grow heavy again. She drifts into a second sleep and wakes only when the city itself begins to stir, with the cries of street vendors and the groan of cartwheels on stone, marking the true start of the Roman day. This pattern, first sleep, a waking interval, second sleep, was not unique to Flavia, and it was not unique to Rome. It appears in sources from across the ancient and medieval world, suggesting something startling, that this might be closer to humanity's natural biological rhythm than the single unbroken slumber most of us experience today, made possible only by the invention of artificial light that pushed bedtimes later and compressed the night into one undivided block. But before we go further into what that waking hour meant to the Romans, the gods they believed ruled it, the fears it carried, the rituals built around it, we need to understand something else first, because Rome's relationship with night was not only a private, personal experience inside the home, it was something the entire civilization, from the lowest slave to the emperor himself, was forced to negotiate. And that negotiation began with a problem so basic that it's almost laughable. Rome, for most of its history, had no real way to consistently measure the night at all.
Daylight in Rome was measured by sundials, dividing the time between sunrise and sunset into 12 hours. But here's the strange part. Those hours were not fixed lengths like our modern 60-minute hours. A Roman hour in June, with its long daylight, was considerably longer than a Roman hour in December. The day simply stretched or shrank to fill 12 equal portions, whatever the season demanded. Night, meanwhile, was divided differently, into 4 watches, called vigiliae, used primarily by soldiers and guards to organize who stood watch and when. Each watch lasted roughly 3 hours, though again, the exact length shifted with the seasons. For the common Roman lying in bed, there was no clock to consult in the dark, no way to glance over and know it was 2 a.m. There was only the depth of the silence, the position of the stars if you could see them through a window, and the sound of the city, or the eerie absence of it. This mattered enormously because it meant the Romans related to night not as a measured stretch of time to be optimized and filled, the way we now treat our sleep schedules with apps and trackers, but as a qualitative experience, a different mode of existence altogether, governed less by the clock and more by darkness itself, by ritual, and by fear. And it is that fear we have to sit with now, because to understand why a Roman waking at midnight did not simply get up and light every lamp in the house, we need to understand what the Romans believed was actually moving through their city while they slept. The Romans did not believe the night was empty. They believed it belonged to specific powers, gods and spirits, whose domain began the moment the sun disappeared. Nox, the primordial goddess of night herself, was said to be so ancient and so powerful that even Jupiter, king of the gods, was said to tread carefully around her. The Romans inherited from the Greeks a vision of night as the mother of terrifying forces, sleep and death described as her twins, born from the same dark womb. And then there were the spirits believed to walk during the hours of deepest dark, the lemures, restless and potentially malevolent spirits of the dead, and the larvae, hostile ghosts said to torment the living. So feared were these spirits that the Romans held an entire festival, the Lemuria, in May, during which the head of a household would rise at midnight, walk barefoot through the house, and throw black beans over his shoulder 9 times, repeating a ritual phrase to drive these unwelcome spirits from the house, performed deliberately during that same dead hour of the night when so many Romans found themselves naturally, biologically awake. This is the layer of the story that changes everything. That midnight waking, the one Flavia experienced quietly and without alarm, was not just a biological quirk. It was woven into an entire cosmology. The Romans were waking night after night directly into the hour their own religion told them belonged to spirits, to ghosts, to the goddess of night herself. And rather than this being a source of constant terror, it became ritualized, understood, almost domesticated. A strange sacred hour that the living and the dead were both believed to share. But not everyone experienced that hour the same way. For some Romans, the dead of night was not sacred, it was simply dangerous. And the danger didn't come from spirits at all, it came from other people. Here is something almost no one expects to learn about ancient Rome. By law, wheeled vehicles were largely banned from the city streets during daylight hours. Julius Caesar himself, in the 1st century BCE, formalized restrictions that pushed the heavy cart traffic supplying the city's roughly 1 million residents into the night, which means that the very hour when Flavia and millions like her were experiencing their natural, quiet waking, the dead of night, sacred to Nox and her spirits, was also the hour when ox carts loaded with grain, wine, and building stone came rumbling and screeching through Rome's narrow streets on iron-rimmed wheels over stone pavement. The Roman satirist Juvenal complained bitterly that the noise alone was enough to wake the dead, that sleep in Rome was a luxury only the very rich, in their houses set back from the street, could properly afford. So picture it now, the full and contradictory truth of it. A city where the same dark hours were simultaneously sacred and chaotic, simultaneously a time for quiet communion with household gods, and a time of grinding wheels, shouting drivers, and genuine physical danger in the streets. The poor of Rome, crammed into towering wooden insulae that creaked and occasionally collapsed, experiencing fire as a constant terror, slept through this clattering, uneasy night in buildings so flimsy that the Emperor Augustus himself had to pass laws limiting their height. The wealthy, behind their thick walls and guarded doors, experienced a different night altogether, quieter, but no less haunted by the same beliefs about spirits and the thinness of the world after dark. This is the tension sitting at the heart of our story. Rome was an empire of extraordinary engineering, capable of building the Pantheon's still unreinforced concrete dome, capable of aqueducts that carried water for miles using nothing but gravity and precision. Yet this same civilization had not solved, and arguably had no desire to solve, the very basic chaos of its own nights. Why? The answer takes us somewhere unexpected. into the realm not of engineering, but of the human body itself, and a question that modern sleep science only began seriously investigating in the last few decades. Was Flavia's broken sleep actually closer to how humans are biologically designed to rest than anything we do today?
In the early 1990s, a psychiatrist named Thomas Ware ran an experiment that would quietly upend a belief most people had never even thought to question. He took a group of volunteers and placed them in conditions designed to mimic the natural world before artificial light existed. 14 hours of darkness every night for weeks at a time, with no clocks, no electric lighting, nothing to interrupt the body's own rhythms. What happened next is the moment where our story stops being history and becomes something closer to a scientific confession. Within a matter of weeks, without exception, every single participant in Ware's study began sleeping the same way, not in one long block. They fell asleep for roughly 4 hours, woke for 1 to 3 hours in the middle of the night, calm, alert, not anxious, and then fell into a second 4-hour sleep before morning. Ware's subjects, modern Americans with no knowledge of ancient Rome, no exposure to the idea of first sleep and second sleep, independently rediscovered in a laboratory the exact pattern that Flavia, the baker's wife, lived every single night 2,000 years earlier. This is the turning point of our story, because it suggests something the Romans never needed a study to tell them, because they were already living it. That segmented sleep, 2 distinct sleep periods divided by a period of quiet wakefulness, may not be a strange historical curiosity at all. It may be the default human sleep pattern, the one written into our biology long before anyone invented the wick lamp, the gas light, or the electric bulb. What we now consider normal sleep, one uninterrupted 8-hour block, may in fact be the unusual chapter in this story, a relatively recent invention made possible only once artificial light grew cheap and bright enough to push bedtimes later and compress 2 natural sleep phases into one. Historian A. Roger Eckerch, whose research first brought widespread attention to this pattern in pre-industrial societies, traced references to first sleep and second sleep across hundreds of documents, from court records and medical texts to private letters and literature, spanning from antiquity through to the early modern era, found across cultures from Europe to Africa to parts of Asia. The pattern Flavia lived was not a Roman peculiarity. It appears to have been, for most of human history, simply how human beings slept. If we only looked at Flavia's household, this would be a story about one city. But Rome was an empire that, at its height, stretched from the fog-soaked hills of Britain to the deserts of Syria, and the way its people slept tells us just as much about power, hierarchy, and survival as it does about biology. Consider the Roman soldier. On the frontier, along Hadrian's Wall in the north of Britain, or in fortresses along the Rhine and Danube, sleep was not a private, sacred negotiation with household gods. It was rationed, structured, and weaponized. The night was divided into 4 watches precisely because someone always had to be awake. A soldier might sleep his 4-hour block, then rise into the freezing dark to stand guard over a wall separating the empire from everything it feared lay beyond it, while his fellow soldiers, 50 feet away, lived through their own version of that strange, wakeful middle-of-the-night hour, except theirs was not spent in prayer. It was spent staring into darkness, listening for the sound of an enemy who might never come or might already be there. Now consider the other extreme, a Roman senator or wealthy merchant in a villa overlooking the sea near Pompeii or Herculaneum, his nights guarded by slaves, his rooms lit by however many oil lamps his fortune could buy. For him, that midnight waking hour might not be spent in fear or ritual at all, but in something closer to leisure, reading by lamplight, the privilege of artificial illumination itself a status symbol most Romans could never afford. The historian and naturalist Pliny the Elder reportedly used these quiet hours to study and dictate notes, a habit that centuries before electric light made night owls common, marked him as someone who had access to a resource almost no one else in the ancient world, enough oil and enough wealth to push back against the dark. And then consider the rural countryside where the overwhelming majority of the empire's population actually lived. Farmers whose lives ran on a rhythm even older than Rome itself, dictated entirely by the sun, the seasons, and the needs of livestock. For them, the line between first sleep and second sleep might be marked not by prayer or study, but by the practical demands of a farm that never stopped needing attention. Checking on animals, tending a fire, rising before dawn to begin the long agricultural day. This is the layer of the story most documentaries skip past, but it's essential. The segmented sleep pattern wasn't uniform in meaning across the empire, even if it was strikingly uniform in form. Slave and senator, soldier and farmer, all of them very likely experienced the same biological rhythm, waking in the dead of night, sleeping in two distinct phases. But what they did with that hour and what it meant to them depended entirely on where they stood in the brutal hierarchy of Roman society. There is something else worth sitting with before we move toward the end of this story, something almost tender hidden inside all this historical and biological detail. Sleep researchers who have studied modern volunteers placed into wear-style conditions report something curious about that middle-of-the-night waking period. When people are not anxious about it, when they're not staring at a clock calculating how many hours of sleep they're losing, a distinctly modern anxiety, the waking hour tends to produce a state of unusual calm, slowed brain waves resembling meditation, a kind of unforced, unhurried clarity that's difficult to access during the rush of daylight hours. It's tempting, and perhaps not unreasonable, to wonder if this is part of why the Romans built so much meaning into that hour rather than fighting against it. They had no concept that broken sleep was a problem to be solved, because to them it was likely not broken at all. It was simply how a night unfolded. Two sleeps with a window of quiet awareness between them. A window the Romans filled with prayer, with study, with conversation, with the rituals of Lemuria, with simply lying still in the dark and listening to a city that, for one suspended hour, belonged to gods, ghosts, and the half-dreaming minds of a million sleepers. We, by contrast, have largely lost that hour. The invention of cheap, bright artificial light, first gas lamps in the 18th and 19th centuries, then electric lighting that could turn night into something resembling day at the flick of a switch, gradually erased the need and eventually the cultural memory of segmented sleep. Bedtimes crept later. The natural waking window in the middle of the night, no longer reinforced by true darkness, began to disappear from most people's experience entirely, until a single 8-hour block became not just common, but assumed to be the only correct way human beings have ever slept. And so when a modern person wakes at 3 a.m. and cannot immediately fall back asleep, they often feel something the Romans likely never felt in that same moment: anxiety, a sense that something is wrong with them, that their body has failed at a simple, natural task. Where Flavia might have risen, prayed quietly at her household shrine, spoken softly with her husband, and drifted back to sleep without a second thought, her modern counterpart instead reaches for a phone, watches the artificial blue light flood the room, and lies awake calculating lost hours, turning what may be one of the oldest, most natural rhythms of the human body into a genuine suffering.
If there is a single hinge point in this story, the moment the ancient pattern of two sleeps began its long, slow death, it did not happen in Rome. It happened more than 1,000 years later, gradually, almost invisibly, as European and American cities began lighting their streets and then their homes with greater and greater intensity. Each technological leap, whale oil lamps,
gas lighting, and finally Edison's incandescent bulb in the late 19th century pushed the boundary of useful, comfortable wakefulness later and later into the night, compressing the natural two-phase sleep pattern that Flavia and Ware's 20th century test subjects, and very likely most of our ancestors for tens of thousands of years, had always known. By the 20th century, the segmented sleep pattern that once shaped Roman religion, Roman law, and the Roman experience of darkness itself had vanished so completely from cultural memory that when historians first began rediscovering references to first sleep and second sleep in old documents, many assumed they were simply translation errors or poetic flourishes, not a description of how human beings, for most of history, actually slept. This is the strange and quietly humbling truth sitting at the center of our story. An empire that built roads still driven on, aqueducts still standing, legal principles still cited in courtrooms today, understood something about the human body and the human night that we, with all our science and technology, only rediscovered by accident in a darkened laboratory just a few decades ago. So what do we do with this knowledge now? This strange, intimate inheritance from a civilization that vanished over 1,000 years ago, but whose nights, it turns out, may have been wiser than our own. We are not Romans. We cannot and likely should not try to recreate their world, their fear of lemures, their 14-hour darknesses, their carts grinding through unlit streets. But perhaps there is something worth carrying forward from Flavia and her quiet hour in the dark. The simple, almost forgotten idea that waking in the middle of the night is not a malfunction, it is not failure. It may in fact be one of the oldest and most deeply human experiences there is, older than Rome, older than written history itself, written into the architecture of our bodies long before anyone thought to measure the night in hours at all. Perhaps the next time sleep breaks in the dark hours of your own night, and you find yourself staring at the ceiling, unsure why you're awake, it's worth remembering Flavia, somewhere in the ruins of a city now buried under 2,000 years of history, lying quietly in her own version of that same darkness, unafraid, unhurried, simply waiting, the way countless human beings did every single night for almost the entire span of our existence, for sleep to come and find her again. The Romans built an empire that conquered most of the known world, but in the end, it was the night itself, patient, ancient, and far stranger than anyone in a sunlit hour could ever quite remember, that conquered them all the same, every single evening, exactly as it conquers us still.
To understand how dramatically a Roman's experience of night depended on wealth, we have to step back and look at where Romans actually slept. Because the gap between rich and poor in this empire was not just about food or status. It was about something as fundamental as how much darkness, noise, and danger a person had to endure simply to close their eyes. Picture first the insula, the apartment block that housed the overwhelming majority of Rome's urban population. These buildings, sometimes rising 5 or 6 stories on foundations never designed to support that height, were a study in contradiction, profitable for their landlords, miserable for their tenants. The lower floors might have some stone construction and modest comfort, but climb higher and the building grew cheaper, flimsier, and more dangerous with every flight of stairs. Wooden frames, thin partition walls, shared latrines, and a constant gnawing risk of fire, since nearly every flame in the building was an open one. The Roman satirist Juvenal complained that he would rather live in a quiet provincial town than endure another night in Rome listening to a building groan and shift above him, never quite sure if this would be the night it gave way entirely. For the family sleeping in one of these upper rooms, Flavia and her husband among them in our imagined household, there was no true privacy from sound.
The cartwheels Juvenal complained about didn't just disturb the street, they rattled straight up through wooden floors into rooms where entire families, sometimes extended families, shared a single sleeping space. The waking hour in the middle of the night for these Romans was rarely silent. It was filled with the ordinary, constant noise of a packed, flammable, vertical slum. Now picture the other extreme, a villa belonging to a senator built around an open central courtyard. The cubiculum, the bedroom, often positioned deliberately away from the street, sometimes facing an interior garden where the only sounds at night might be water moving through a fountain or wind through cypress trees. The wealthy Roman did not share his sleeping space with extended family, debt, and the threat of collapsing timber. He had, in a meaningful sense, purchased something the poor of Rome could never afford: quiet. A managed, curated darkness, with slaves often sleeping just outside the door, ready to relight a lamp or fetch water the instant their master stirred during that midnight waking hour. This is worth sitting with because it reframes everything we've discussed about the sacred, contemplative nature of that midnight hour. For the wealthy, the dead of night could be exactly what Roman religion suggested it should be: a quiet, almost meditative space for prayer, thought, even study. For the poor, packed into a packed, flammable vertical slum above a street full of grinding cartwheels, that same hour might offer no peace at all. The biology was the same. The experience of it was a study in inequality. There is one more piece of this puzzle that explains why segmented sleep was so universal across Roman society, regardless of class, and it comes down to something almost embarrassingly simple. Light was expensive. Olive oil, the primary fuel for Roman lamps, was a valuable commodity, used not only for lighting, but for cooking, bathing, and trade. Burning it purely to extend the hours of wakefulness into the night was a genuine expense, not something to be done carelessly. A poor family might own only one or two small terracotta lamps, each holding barely enough oil to burn for a few hours before needing to be refilled, and refilling them meant spending money that might otherwise go toward bread, wine, or rent. This economic reality shaped Roman nights as powerfully as any religious belief. Once the sun went down and the household's single lamp burned through its modest ration of oil, there was often genuinely nothing left to do but sleep. There was no late-night reading by an unlimited light source, no staying up for hours simply because one could. The night imposed its own discipline, regardless of how a Roman might have personally felt about going to bed early. The wealthy, by contrast, could afford to burn as much oil as they wished, in as many lamps as they wished, which is precisely why figures like Pliny the Elder, with his famous habit of working through the night by lamplight, stood out as remarkable. He wasn't simply disciplined, he was resourced in a way that allowed him to push back against the natural boundary of darkness that governed nearly everyone else's life. For most Romans, however, rich enough to have several lamps but not wealthy beyond measure, the practical reality was this: you slept when the oil ran low, you woke naturally in the dead of the night when your body's first sleep cycle ended, and you waited, often in near total darkness, for either sleep to reclaim you or dawn to arrive.
A matter of course that every single Roman household would predictably be awake during it. The festival was held across 3 non-consecutive nights in May, the 9th, the 11th, and the 13th, and it was the head of the household, the pater familias, who carried out its central ritual, described by the poet Ovid in his work on the Roman calendar. He rose at midnight, not at dawn, not after breakfast, but precisely in that dead hour the Romans already expected to be awake within. He walked barefoot through his home. Bare feet were thought to carry ritual significance, a kind of vulnerability and humility before the spirits, and he made a particular hand gesture, the mano fica,
believed to ward off evil as he moved from room to room. Then came the heart of the ritual. He washed his hands in pure spring water, filled his mouth with black beans, and walked through the house, casting the beans behind him over his shoulder, repeating again and again, 9 times the words, Haec ego mito, his redimo meque meosque fabis. These I cast, with these beans I redeem myself and my family. The restless spirits of the dead, the lemures, were believed to follow him behind, gathering the beans as a kind of payment, a substitute offering that would satisfy them and persuade them to leave the living household in peace. Finally, the paterfamilias washed his hands once more, struck together bronze vessels to make a ringing noise, and called out 9 times into the dark, Manes exite paterni, ancestral spirits, depart. Think about what this means. An entire Roman family and households across the city doing the exact same thing on the exact same nights was expected to wake deliberately in the dead of night, not because anything was wrong, but because the culture had built a sacred appointment directly into that hour their bodies were already inclined to surface from sleep. The Lemuria wasn't fighting against segmented sleep. It was riding on top of it, using a biological rhythm the entire population already shared as the scaffolding for one of Rome's most important domestic religious observances. Public business was even said to halt during these days. Temples closed, marriages were considered inadvisable to hold during this period, because the entire city, in some sense, was oriented around the unsettled, liminal nature of the dead of night. Visual: an older man at a writing desk, the only Roman in frame fully awake and alert, a lamp burning steadily, his stylus moving across wax. Not every Roman treated the midnight hour with fear or ritual. Some of Rome's greatest minds treated it as opportunity. The philosopher and statesman Seneca, writing in the 1st century, was preoccupied throughout his letters and essays with the question of how a person should use their time, famously arguing that most people squander their lives without ever realizing how short they are, that time itself is the one possession truly worth protecting. For a mind like Seneca's, the quiet, ritual-free hours of the night represented something valuable, a stretch of existence without interruption, without the noise and obligation of Roman public life, without clients calling at the door or the Senate demanding attendance. Several ancient sources describe philosophers and writers using the depth of night for reflection and composition precisely because it offered something daylight in Rome rarely could: solitude. Cicero, too, in his philosophical and rhetorical works, returned again and again to the night as a space uniquely suited to thought, separate from the transactional bustle of the forum. There's a reason so much of what survives from Roman intellectual life carries the faint imprint of candlelit, late-hour composition, because for a certain class of Roman, educated, literate, free from the physical labor that exhausted most of the population by sundown, the dead of night wasn't haunted, it was clarifying. The same hour that sent an ordinary household reaching for black beans and bronze vessels to ward off ancestral spirits might, in a senator's study 3 streets away, simply be the quietest, most productive hour of his entire day. This duality, the same dark hour experienced as sacred terror in one household and intellectual sanctuary in another, captures something essential about Rome itself, a civilization capable of extraordinary rational achievement built on a population still steeped, almost universally, in a worldview where gods and spirits moved through the same hours that philosophers used for cold, careful reasoning. The Romans did not see this as a contradiction. Both truths lived inside the same dark hour, inside the same city, sometimes inside the same household. Visual, return now, before our conclusion, to the thread that ties every single one of these stories together. The philosopher awake at his desk, the frightened paterfamilias casting beans into the dark, Flavia waking quietly beside her husband, the soldier on the wall straining to hear an enemy that may never come. Every one of them was operating on the same underlying biological rhythm: 2 sleeps, a quiet hour between them, a pattern so deeply written into the human body that it resurfaced unprompted in a windowless modern laboratory nearly 2,000 years after the last Roman emperor fell. What changed across those 2,000 years wasn't the body, it was the meaning we attached to its rhythms. Where Flavia found ritual, prayer, and quiet companionship in her waking hour, we, robbed of true darkness by light pollution that never fully dims, often find only frustration, a glowing phone screen, a racing mind cataloging tomorrow's obligations, and an anxious modern certainty that something has gone wrong simply because we are, for a little while, awake. Final wide shot, Rome at night, every household dark, the city utterly silent under a sky thick with stars no modern city could ever show us again. Rome fell eventually, the way every empire does, not in a single night, but slowly across centuries until the roads cracked, the aqueducts ran dry, and the marble was carried off stone by stone to build something new. But one thing the fall of Rome could not erase, because it was never written in marble or law to begin with, was the rhythm written into every Roman body that ever closed its eyes beneath that empire's vast, dark skies. 2 sleeps, a quiet hour between them, filled however each household chose to fill it, with fear, with prayer, with black beans cast into shadow, with philosophy, with simple, unhurried stillness. It was so ordinary to them that almost no Roman writer thought to explain it, the way none of us today would think to explain why we breathe. It simply was how a night unfolded. We spent centuries forgetting this. We built brighter and brighter lights specifically to erase the need for it, and in doing so, we quietly convinced ourselves that the unbroken 8-hour sleep we now treat as biological law was the only way human beings had ever rested. It took a psychiatrist, a windowless room, and several weeks of true darkness to accidentally prove the Romans right. So, the next time you wake in the depth of the night, with no clock demanding your attention and no obvious reason for your eyes to be open, consider this: you may not be broken. You may simply, for a few quiet minutes, be doing exactly what an empire of 1 million people once did every single night beneath the same dark sky, waiting, patiently, unafraid, for sleep to come and find you again.